Focus on Headline. And let's take a look at what major issues are making the headlines today on Focus on Headline. For this, joining us in our studio, we have our reporters in Anseong and Yoon. Guys, welcome back.
Good evening.
Good evening to you guys. Believe it or not, after all the weeks of covering the Constitutional Court's impeachment trial, today is the final day. We thought the 8th hearing was going to be the last. The Constitutional Court justices did allow 2 more hearings last week with the 9th and 10th hearings. Today, the final hearing, attention focused on how President Yoon will defend his short-lived imposition of martial law. We can argue that maybe in the 8 or so hearings that he actually took part in, arguments were maybe not sufficient enough for him to be relieved of the impeachment motion here. But nevertheless, Hae-jung, you're going to start us off. Final day at the Constitutional Court's impeachment trial. What do you have for us?
Right. The 11th and final impeachment hearing began at 2 p.m. Tuesday. But President Yoon did not arrive in time for the hearing's opening, but joined the proceeding later in the day after 4 p.m. Now, in today's hearing, the justices were set to review the evidence they haven't examined yet before giving both the National Assembly and President Yoon's legal team 2 hours to present their closing arguments. Then the National Assembly's impeachment panel chair, Representative Chung Cheong-rae of the main opposition Democratic Party, and President Yoon are set to deliver their final statements with no time restrictions. President Yoon has reportedly prepared a 40-minute long handwritten speech. He's expected to reiterate arguments previously presented by his legal team that martial law is an executive right of the president and that his declaration of martial law was an act of governance meant to send a warning to the opposition party over its repeated impeachment of government officials and attempts to cut the government budget, as well as concerns over election fraud. Also, focus is on whether the president will issue an apology to the nation for the political turmoil caused by his martial law declaration. Meanwhile, the National Assembly has argued that Yoon's declaration of martial law was illegal and his orders on December 3rd was unconstitutional. It has accused him of trying to blockade the National Assembly and remove lawmakers from the building in an attempt to stop them from voting to lift martial law. National Assembly's impeachment panel chair, Chung Cheong-rae, has said he will use his final arguments to explain why Yoon should be removed from office, how his claims are different from the truth, and how the nation should overcome the current crisis. Legal experts anticipate that the court will deliver its verdict on whether to remove Yoon from office or reinstate him within 2 weeks after Tuesday's hearing, citing the precedents of former presidents Roh Moo-hyun and Park Geun-hye.
Again, I mean, if you look at former President Roh Moo-hyun's impeachment trial, it probably took more deliberation, right? I mean, eventually he was, they didn't impeach him. The Constitutional Court ended up not impeaching him, said that, well, the violation really wasn't bad enough that he's set to be removed. Now, President Park Geun-hye, former President Park Geun-hye, was a different story where I think it moved on a little bit faster. Some people can argue maybe with Yoon's case, it could even move in even faster, right? Considering all the arguments that he was using here. But you have to understand that 40-minute long handwritten speech, that's a long one, all right? Focus on Headline is less than 40 minutes long. And you guys type this up. You guys take like 3 hours each typing this up on a daily basis, right? That's a lot of stuff that you guys are preparing here. To write 40-minute speech is a lot. But if you remember, before President Yoon was impeached and before he was arrested, if you look at some of the address to the nation, it was, like 29 minutes or so. Never really was a proper apology to the nation, right? And I think the consensus among his advisors was that for him to apologize, it acknowledges that he had done something wrong. Now, of course, what he's been trying to prove throughout all these times, all these weeks during the Constitutional Court trial, was that he did nothing wrong, that he had to do this. So, again, we're not getting any of the informations just yet. And, of course, once the hearings conclude, the deliberation period does begin here. As we said, it might take maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks at max here. But walk us through the steps, Haejung.
Sure. Presiding Justice Chung Yong-sik will present his review before all 8 justices vote for or against impeachment. The ruling will be drafted based on the majority opinion. If the presiding justice holds a minority view, another justice from the majority will be assigned to draft the decision. The court will then decide the date to announce the verdict, which is expected to be within 2 weeks after the last hearing, likely around mid-March. And if 6 or more of the 8 justices vote in favor of impeachment, President Yoon will be removed from office, leading to a snap presidential election within 60 days. However, if at least 3 justices oppose impeachment, the motion will be dismissed and President Yoon will immediately resume his duties. And the Constitutional Court is set to rule on the constitutionality of acting President Choi Sang-mok's decision to defer the appointment of Justice nominee Ma Eun-hyuk to the 9-member branch. Now, the decision is going to be out this Thursday, and if the Constitutional Court rules Choi Sang-mok's decision as unconstitutional, Choi will be obligated to appoint Ma as a justice, which in this case will have an impact on President Yoon's impeachment case.
That's right. And again, I mean, even from the start of the impeachment trial, I mean, you had the Constitutional Court Justice Chief saying that this was going to be a speedy one. It only took 10 hearings plus today's one. We could count that as the 11th hearing. And so, again, the consensus is that it's probably not going to last the whole time. And it really didn't help that Yoon's legal team were basically attacking the Constitutional Court and the justices for being unconstitutional or biased with their hearings. And so, that all adds up, right? Eventually, that all adds up here. And we'll see. And they're saying if in 2 weeks that the decision is made, and then you have 60 days until the snap election takes place, that takes us to somewhere after the Children's Day break. Sometime mid-May is when the snap election might take place.
May.
The
5th month of the
know,
year.
Yes, I said May. I know yesterday I did. I kind of forgot what the 5th month was. I'm still stuck in February right now. Again, today was the last hearing, or is, as it's still taking place right now. Proceedings will conclude with closing arguments, again, from both the National Assembly's legal team and President Yoon himself. Let's get more on what we can expect as I believe the hearing is still taking place right now.
Sure. Yoon now has become the first sitting president in South Korean history to personally deliver a final statement at the Constitutional Court. And given that a possible impeachment ruling in favor of his removal would mark his last public address as president, attention is focused on what message he will deliver and which will come out later on. And now, taking a look at the National Assembly's stance first, lawmakers argue that President Yoon completely gave up his position as leader of a democratic republic the moment he declared martial law, and they are calling for his swift removal from office. Attorney Lee Kwang-bum, representing the National Assembly, was the first to speak during Tuesday's final arguments. He stated that President Yoon has trampled upon the democratic constitutional order that South Korean people have defended with their lives and blood. He further accused Yoon of ignoring the existence of the opposition, being obsessed with eliminating his political rivals, and falling into the delusion that his party's defeat in the general election was the result of election fraud. He went on to say that Yoon has sought to privatize the state and place himself above the constitution, and this is called dictatorship. It continued, even now, President Yoon is attempting to rally his supporters through lies and exaggeration, deepening the state of extreme chaos and disorder. He then posed a pressing question: if he returns to office, who can guarantee that he will not declare a second or third emergency martial law? And while President Yoon arrived later than expected on this Tuesday, like Haejung said, we are still waiting for his remarks to be compiled, and we will deliver you the details of his final remarks tomorrow. But Ahead of the 10th and the final hearing, conservative analysts expressed their hope that Yoon may issue a message of national unity in his final statement as the president of South Korea. And some conservative media outlets have suggested that he should offer an apology, especially when considering the early presidential election. But given Yoon's stance so far, it is widely expected that he will not acknowledge any responsibility. Currently, Yoon stands a trial on charges of insurrection for declaring the December 3rd martial law, a move that allegedly disrupted the constitutional order. And if the Constitutional Court rules in favor of impeachment, he will be immediately removed from office, losing the presidential immunity from prosecution that shields him from criminal investigations. And without this immunity, authorities could launch probes into various allegations against him, including the so-called the mysterious political broker Myeongtae-gyun Gate and the Marine Corporal Choi Soo-gun's case. And his removal would likely open the door to multiple investigations into his administration.
Yeah, I know we talked about only the insurrection charges and the abuse of power charges right now, which, by the way, for a sitting president, the only criminal charges that a sitting president could face is insurrection, right? Everything else, and abuse of power. Everything else, you have the presidential immunity, which again won't matter anymore if he does get impeached by the Constitutional Court. And so he's already facing the trial. We already had the preliminary hearing on the criminal trial of President Yoon Suk Yeol, right? For charges of insurrection and abuse of power. But like that's pretty big. All right, because if you are found guilty, not only can you face life imprisonment, but also death penalty is also possible. Although here in Korea, technically it's it's gone, right? I mean, there hasn't been a death sentence in a really long time. Even if there was, people in death row, they don't execute them anymore. But like life in prison, that's pretty big. But now he might be facing other trials right now, right? I mean, these are things, the Myeongtae-gyun case, which actually that's going to leak into other issues, not just President Yoon Suk Yeol, but First Lady Kim Gun-hee is being mentioned a lot in the Myeongtae-gyun investigation that's slowly coming out, right? They had to do the forensics on like the 50,000 text messages or phone calls.
From the gold phone.
Yeah, the golden phone that they found. And of course, the other special counsel probe that kept on getting vetoed, Marine Corporal Choi Soo-gun's case, that now could be investigated, which I think is going to now lead to criminal investigations of a number of other officials. Maybe presidential officials, maybe military commanders, who knows? So this is going to open up the floodgates here. And that starts with the impeachment trial, which, again, may end finally after 2 weeks or so. We've been talking about a number of devastating incidents and accidents that have been taking place here in South Korea. Again, from the end of December moving forward, a number of ship accidents as well, plane accidents, you name it. And while we're hoping that these incidents will not happen anymore, really shocking, devastating, heartbreaking scene, if you've had a chance to see the footages of this. A bridge collapsing at an expressway construction site over in Anseong on Tuesday morning, killing 4 workers, injuring 6 others. This happened early in the morning of, not really early, but 9:50 a.m. This is around 65 kilometers south of Seoul. It was during a construction. South Korea, again, known for its proper construction methods. It is very rare to see something like this, but still devastating nevertheless. Haejung, walk us through what exactly happened earlier this morning.
At the Cheonan-Anseong section of the Seoul's Haejong Expressway in Anseong City, several slabs placed on a pier on a construction site fell to the ground, knocking off or burying 10 people working at the site. Of them, 4 died and 5 were seriously injured, and 1 sustained minor injuries, according to the fire authorities. The casualties were all male workers in their late 40s to mid-60s. The nationalities were identified as 7 Koreans and 3 Chinese. And initially, the death toll was announced as 2, but rose to 4 after one more critically injured Chinese male died in the hospital, and the last Korean rescued was found in cardiac arrest and died at 2:21 p.m., 4.5 hours after the incident. The builder, Hyundai Engineering, apologized for the loss of lives and injuries. After activating a level 2 response posture, authorities issued an order mobilizing firefighters and national firefighting resources to ensure a comprehensive national response. And acting President Choi Sang-mok also gave emergency instructions to deploy all available resources and personnel for the rescue operation.
The footage that was seen across the country today was from the black box of a car, right? Now here in Korea, you have the front view camera and the rear view camera. And this driver, again, sent in the footage from the rear view, which means that it really was maybe seconds after he was able to pass that little underpass, right? Not underpass, the bridge that was being constructed there. It was a very close call for the driver, but this was a massive construction project, right? It wasn't just Hyundai Engineering that was it. Hyundai Engineering had the majority of something like 50%. They had 50% invested in it. Hoban Construction had 30%, and then I believe Gyeonggi, there you go. Gyeonggi also had 20%. And so it was partnered with 3 companies putting into this, which is a major project right now. And normally with a project with this size, they put in a lot of efforts to make sure that safety is the priority. But it's unfortunate to hear this happen. Made it up, says hard work all your life, and that happens again. That's really the unfortunate side of all this, right? We're going to move on to the economy. As market expectation suggested, and as everyone had anticipated, the Bank of Korea's Monetary Policy Board lowered the benchmark interest rate by 25 basis points. Alongside this move, the central bank also made a significant downward revision to the economic growth forecast for the year. It's already relatively low, and they brought it down a bit more here. So let's get some figures.
Yes, at its second monetary policy meeting of the year today, the Bank of Korea decided to cut the benchmark interest rate by 25 basis points, bringing it down from 3% to 2.75%. And this decision comes as the domestic economy faces growing downside risk despite a relative stabilization of exchange rate volatility compared to the previous month. And with this rate adjustment, the interest rate gap between South Korea and the United States has widened once again, now standing at 1.75 percentage points. And at the same time, the Bank of Korea revised its economic growth forecast for the year, lowering it from the previous estimate of 1.9% to just 1.5%. And the downward revision reflects ongoing uncertainties, including Trump 2.0's hardline tariff policies. And what's concerning is that this latest forecast falls even below last month's unofficial estimate of 1.6% to 1.7%, which had already accounted for the economic downturn following the recent political turmoil caused by declaration of martial law. And it is also lower than projections by other institutions, including the Korea Development Institute, the government itself, and the average forecast of 8 global investment banks. Analysts suggest that this revision reflects concerns over a slowdown in export growth, as well as uncertainty surrounding the timing of a potential supplementary budget aimed at stimulating the economy. And looking ahead to next year, the Bank of Korea maintained its economic growth projection at 1.8%, the same as its previous forecast, but with the country's potential growth rate now dipping below 2%, concerns are mounting that South Korea may be entering a prolonged period of low growth. Meanwhile, the central bank kept its inflation forecast unchanged at 1.9% for both this year and next year. And it noted that while exchange rate fluctuations could exert upward pressure on prices, weak demand is expected to keep inflation hovering around the 2% mark.
So BOK Governor Lee Chang-yong came out basically saying with the next year's forecast of 1.8%. I mean, he was sounding kind of like optimistic. Like he was like basically say, look, we have to accept it, right? We have to accept it. I think his words were, we're so used to seeing very high growth over the years that when we see numbers that are under 2%, like 1.8%, we automatically start panicking.
Right.
But the numbers that we've been getting over the past few months now, if not a year, full year, there are red flags as to the current state of the Korean economy, right? I mean, we continue to talk about downward revision to this year's growth rate. We keep talking about these robust export numbers, but all of a sudden these numbers come out and so we're going to bring down the growth numbers forecast because we're not seeing as good of an export figure as we initially thought. And then, of course, we have to start thinking about the trade policies of the Trump administration, which is going to further bring down the export figures here. And so 1.8% might not seem like a bad thing, but who knows? It's going to go down even more, right? I mean, there's going to be, we continue to see these downward revisions. And
usually analysts said the economic growth rate under 2% is pretty alarming.
No, it is alarming.
Yeah.
But there's multiple other factors that are going in that signals that, again, South Korea seems to be in a recession right now, but the government and the central bank seems to avoid using the R word, right? Recession, and it's just non-existent or something like that. As we talked about how the South Korea Central Bank slashed its benchmark interest rate by 25 basis points on Tuesday. It is an effort to shore up economic growth. We have been seeing weak domestic demand, certainly a lot of uncertainty both home and abroad. Haejung, let's break down a little bit more on the latest decision by the central bank.
Right. As we just covered, the key interest rate is now brought down to 2.75%. The move came during the bank's second Monetary Policy Board meeting of the year, which resumed its rate-cutting cycle after two consecutive rate cuts in October and November last year, followed by a pause in January. So after October, the key interest rate fell by 0.75 basis points from 3.5% to 2.75% over the course of 4 months. Now, it's estimated that a cut in lending rates by just 0.75 percentage points would reduce the interest burden on household borrowers by more than 9 trillion Korean won annually, and this is roughly $6.3 billion US dollars. This means that the annual interest burden per household borrower is expected to fall by about 463,000 won on average, which comes to roughly 323 US dollars. Now, the latest cut is expected to ease the burden not only on households, but also on small businesses and the self-employed who have been struggling with high interest rates as well. It's estimated that the interest burden on the self-employed would be reduced by 5.1 trillion won or 3.6 billion US dollars when the interest rate is lowered by 0.75 percentage points. But the problem is that the Bank of Korea's rate cut has been slow to be reflected in the interest rates of financial institutions. In fact, household lending rates at banks turned out to be actually higher than before the rate cut. According to the Bank of Korea, the household lending rate based on new loan accounts at depository banks was 4.72% per year in last December. And although banks have been lowering their borrowing rates in the new year, it's still difficult for consumers to actually feel the effect of lower interest rates. So financial authorities have also emphasized the need for an overhaul of the basis for calculating banks' lending rates.
I never understood the bank's lending rates.
Me neither.
How you're calculating this, right? Because just because it's brought down to 2.75, does that mean your mortgage rate is 2.75?
Absolutely not.
No, I mean 2.75 seems like great figures, right? If I remember correctly, my mortgage rate was something like 6 point something percent.
Wow,
this was when
high.
that was when the benchmark interest rate was like in the 4% range, when it was like much higher than this, right? But now, I mean, luckily the government came out with like a newborn mortgage lending rates. So thanks to my daughter, now my lending rates are very, very low.
Multiple children families.
Yeah, but the bank calculates it completely different. I would not be surprised, even if it dips down to 2.75, that the average would be around in the mid to high 4%, which is a significant burden for a lot of the homeowners who bought houses during the peak, right? During the COVID-19, when everyone's like, oh, it's zero interest rate. Everyone's, it's dumb not to borrow money. Well, you're going to have to pay that back sooner or later. We're going to look into the government's major announcement earlier today. They're going to start lifting development restriction areas, the so-called the green belt zones, equivalent to an area 15 times the size of Gyeonggi-do's, to establish 15 strategic projects outside the capital region. So it's not about removing green belt zones to create more apartments. I think they were looking into that not too long ago, but there's a lot of red flags on that. This was announced by the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, and Transport. I believe Acting President Choi Sang-mok also made the announcement on this earlier today. So let's get more on this.
Yes, the ministry announced on Tuesday after a cabinet meeting review that it has selected 15 national and regional strategic projects in non-capital areas where green belts can be released. In Busan, this means plans are underway for the creation of the second eco-delta city and the Haeundae Advanced Science Park, while in Daejeon, projects include a national industrial complex for nano semiconductors and aerospace. The total green belt area under consideration for release across these 15 projects is about 14.5 times the size of Gyeonggi-do, with 10 of the sites focusing on industrial and logistic complexes. And Gyeonggi-do is South Korea's main finance district with size of 8.4 square meters. Notably, this is the first significant increase in the total releasable greenbelt area since the Lee Myung-bak administration in 2008, a span of 17 years. And under the new plan, greenbelt areas that are normally off limits due to strict environmental evaluations that falls in grades 1 and 2 will be replaced by designated alternative greenbelts, and local governments are primarily considering public lands for these alternative designations. And while the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, and Transport maintains that preserving the intrinsic value of greenbelts remains paramount, it explained that the selection of these strategic projects aim to inject volatility into the regions. Additionally, to curb real estate speculations, the selected strategic project sites will be designated as land transaction permit zones. And the total budget for these 15 projects amounts to 27.8 trillion won. And the ministry has indicated that considering additional demands from local governments, a second round of selections may follow.
Let's move on here. As we talked about this with our expert yesterday, with Professor Robert Kelly, yesterday marked the 3-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that led to the still ongoing Ukraine war. The UN Security Council on Monday adopted a U.S. drafted resolution on the 3rd anniversary. There was also a EU-led, Ukraine-led resolution as well. But again, it was a very contrasting resolution that we saw. Similar, yet some stark differences in the wording of these proposals. But again, it seems like the U.S. under the Trump administration are taking a more quote-unquote neutral stance with their U.S.-led proposal. Haejang, let's talk about this.
Now, the short resolution reflects Trump's more conciliatory stance towards Russia. The Security Council adopted the U.S. resolution with 10 votes in favor, while France, Britain, Denmark, Greece, and Slovenia abstained. Russia voted in favor after failing to amend it and vetoing European bids to add language supporting Ukraine. This resolution had drawn opposition from European countries to hold Russia accountable for its aggression, but ultimately passed with the majority of votes in favor. Now, the U.S. resolution reflecting President Donald Trump's policy toward Russia and Ukraine called for a swift end to the conflict and lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia without mentioning Russian aggression. Now, South Korea's ambassador to the United Nations, Hwang Jung-guk, expressed disappointment that Russia's responsibility for the aggression and Ukraine's territorial integrity were not addressed in the adopted resolution. And earlier in the day, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution proposed by Ukraine condemning Russia's full-scale invasion by a vote of 93 in favor, 18 against, and 65 abstaining. South Korea voted in favor, and this resolution characterized the war in Ukraine as Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine and emphasized the need to fulfill previous UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia And in addition to Russia, the U.S., Hungary, and Israel voted against the resolution. Meanwhile, the U.S., which opposed to the Ukraine-led resolution, submitted a separate resolution that emphasized the need for a swift end to the conflict and removed language on Ukraine's territorial integrity. But the original resolution was rejected, and an amended version that included language on Russia's aggression was adopted with 93 votes in favor, 8 against, and 73 abstentions. South Korea also voted in favor of the resolution.
So imagine that, right? Imagine that. The U.S. opposing a Ukraine-led resolution because they didn't like the words. Russia as being the aggressor in this war, right? And again, I mean, initially that the U.S. and the interesting thing about this is apparently some of the reports that are coming out is when the Ukraine led, it was also led by the EU as well. It was both the EU and the Ukrainians who led this proposal that passed again. The Americans were apparently telling countries, listen, don't vote in favor of that. And then came out with their proposal, which again was shot down by the UN. And then they had to come up with this amended version, which eventually passed here. So you could obviously tell the stark difference. But when you're looking at this, some are seeing this as a win for Ukraine, right? Saying that, well, at least the UN is saying that they're going to still side with Ukraine and maybe not with the current Trump administration, the way that they're viewing the resolution of this war. But you look at the immense amount of number of countries that abstained in the EU-Ukraine-led proposal. You might start thinking, well, the support for Ukraine is diminishing quite a bit, right, after 3 years here. And so I don't know how Ukraine is going to be taking this, but none of this is legally binding. But it just kind of shows where each countries are standing when it comes to the issue here. This is probably, in my opinion, one of the most awkward handshakes I've seen in my recent memory here. Marking the third anniversary of the war in Ukraine, you had U.S. President Donald Trump and French President Emmanuel Macron holding a summit, agreeing on the need to end the war and restore regional peace. They agree on that, right? I mean, I think it's the method in which the agreement's going to be put in place. But I know the two leaders don't really like each other from day one, but this meeting was an interesting one. Hey, tell us about the summit.
Yes, while the talks began in a friendly atmosphere with awkward handshakes, tensions surfaced as disagreements emerged, exposing divisions between the U.S. and Europe over Ukraine. The two leaders aligned on the broad concept of a European peacekeeping force to ensure Ukraine's security, but key differences remained on the details. The two leaders first clashed over the causes of the war and the role of various nations. President Macron was firm in his stance, stating that peace must not mean Ukraine's surrender, nor should it mean a ceasefire without security guarantees. It must be a peace that ensures Ukraine's sovereignty. And their perspectives on Russia were also clearly different. When asked whether he considered President Vladimir Putin a dictator, President Trump responded, "I don't use such terms lightly, but we know that he recently referred to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as a dictator." In contrast, President Macron was unequivocal, stating that Russia is the aggressor, holding Moscow squarely responsible for the war. On the matter of a European peacekeeping force led by the UK and France, both leaders appeared to reach a general agreement, and President Trump stated he had no objections to the initiative and suggested that President Putin would likely accept it. Another point of contention was the U.S. commitment to supporting Ukraine. Trump stopped short of making a clear pledge, fueling further debate, and the issue is expected to be addressed in the meeting between President Trump and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, scheduled for Wednesday local time. And despite the unresolved issues, President Trump reiterated his belief that a ceasefire could be reached within weeks, and he also revealed that a mineral agreement with Ukraine would soon be finalized, adding that President Zelensky is expected to visit the U.S. this week or next to sign the accord, further underscoring showing Trump's confidence in his ability to bring the war to an end.
I still don't understand the mineral agreement because it's kind of like the Biden administration just gave the money to Ukraine, right? And then now all of a sudden you have someone else that come in and go, hey, by the way, you have to pay that back. But Biden administration, no, you have to pay it back, right? But that handshake I was telling you about, I don't know how you guys shake their hands, but sometimes I do this too. You know, it's a power move, right?
Right,
firm
handshake,
right? And so Trump did the firm handshake, whereas Macron did not want to touch his hand as much as possible. He kind of like pulled it out, and it was just awkward here.
He has done that before too, several times with the leaders of different countries.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. It was awkward. Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Monday that Russia was ready to work with foreign partners, including the U.S., to develop the reserves of rare and critical minerals, including in regions of Ukraine currently under Russian control. Haejung, tell us about the details of this.
Right. Russian President Vladimir Putin said Russia is ready to offer the United States and other foreign partners the opportunity for joint exploration of the country's rare earth metal deposits. He specifically mentioned that Russia could also cooperate with the U.S. and other foreign countries on rare earth deposits in Russia's, quote, new territories. Now, the new territories refer to Ukrainian territory that Russia had occupied since February 2022 in a special military operation. And the region, which lies on the eastern front, has large deposits of rare earths. And the comments came shortly after U.S. President Donald Trump said that major economic development transactions with Russia would take place. Putin, who also held a government meeting on rare earths on Monday, disclosed that Russian and American companies are discussing joint projects. Putin said that joint projects could also be extended to the energy sector as well, and said that some Russian and U.S. companies are already in touch, although he did not give the details.
Let's turn our focus over to Germany this time. The Christian Democratic Union, or CDU, and the Christian Social Union, CSU Alliance, which emerged as the largest party in the German federal election. I kid you not, I feel like this is like churches fighting, has announced plans to negotiate a coalition government with the incumbent Social Democratic Party, or the SPD. The goal is to finalize the coalition by April. Interesting developments with the German political scene as well. Seong, tell us more about this.
Yes, speaking at a press conference in Berlin on Monday, CDU leader Friedrich Merz stated that his party will engage in constructive and swift discussions with the SPD to form a government by around Easter, that is April 20th. And starting today, the two parties are expected to enter negotiations over key policy directions for the next government, but major disagreements remain on issues such as refugee policy, taxation, and energy transition, making the negotiations very challenging.
All right, there you have it. We'll keep you guys posted on this. But for now, guys, thank you very much for your reports. Have a safe rest of your night. We'll see you guys again.
Thank you.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang radio application, or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.